Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. This is DebateSeinsei. I'm here with Matthew Shapiro, JD.
Hello.
I am Jared Kubika Miller, the debate coach and professor of communications. Today, we are going to talk about something that I struggle to explain to students all the time, and it's the concept known as offense and defense in debate. It seems so simple. These two terms are used all the time, and there's really easy sports analogies to do, but I don't think everyone sees the analogy in debate right off the bat. So let me just give a short explanation, and I'll have Matt jump in on any feedback. So basically, in debate, you can make arguments, and people even call it points sometimes, like, hey, that was a good point, right? So in sports, you score points. If you block somebody else from making a point in sports, that's defense. Same thing applies in debate. If they're trying to make a point and you stop them from making that point, then that's defense. So what's the difference? The difference is, like, if somebody proposes a plan, the difference is saying the plan won't work versus the plan is going to destroy everything. That's the difference between these two, offense and defense, right? So if defense is saying what you said will work won't work, offense is like, not, it's like what you said we should do is going to make things horrible. So I guess, Matt, back in the day, you're starting to learn offense versus defense. What was that like for you? Was it a struggle to try to understand those concepts, to apply them during debates?
You know, it's one of those things that, yeah, in the very beginning, you kind of like people say those words and they don't have a lot of meaning. You know, unlike in sports, I think where, for instance, sports is a good example because of how crystal clear it is, right? Like offense, you are, for instance, in trying to score a point, put a ball in a basket. On defense, you are trying to block the other team, right? So in debate, we're talking about words and concepts and the implications of the inferences that of the words that we say, right? So it is hard compared to sports to kind of explain or to understand the difference between an offensive argument and a defensive argument. And I think you did a good job of saying, you know, any sort of offensive argument is kind of giving a affirmative reason why your plan is good, whereas a defensive argument could either be saying, you know, our plan, they may have some disadvantage, let's say, to your plan, and they say it kills 1,000 people. A defensive argument might say, like, no, it will kill one person, or like it like lessens.
It won't save anybody. Like,
sure.
Yeah, the defensive argument would be like, you have some plan, and in that you are anticipating that this will save lives, and the defensive argument is like, no, that probably isn't going to save lives at all. So it's like the different, and so in debate they call this on case and off case arguments, and oh my God, people get those two things mixed up all the time. I see defensive disadvantages all the time. It's like,
but just to be very clear, like,
yeah,
you can have on, for every listener out there who just doesn't, you know, maybe for flying around a little bit.
Yeah,
you can have offensive and defensive arguments both on and off case. Like,
right.
Those two things aren't, you know, synonymous, I guess, or anything like that. So, in quick rundown for anyone who has no idea what that means still, on case literally just is talking about anything the affirmative team brought as a, you know, plan or reason why they're right or whatever the case may be. And an off case argument is any argument that an opposition team has independently brought to the debate that's not necessarily, you know, direct refutation to an on-case argument. And the lines can be blurred a bit, but that's the premise of an on-case and off-case. And either one of those could be offensive or defensive. And for instance, like one cardinal sin I would say is you don't want any of your, if you're the affirmative team, you don't want any of your out-the-box arguments to be exclusively defensive, let's say that. Like, you need to start giving reasons off the bat in your affirmative case, reasons why you should win. Offensive arguments should be coming out swinging in the one AC, or whatever you want to call it.
See, that's the thing. When I learned about it too, that's what I was taught. You know what I mean? Or eventually you start learning that. At first, you're just kind of like, oh, I have something to say, It's like you just throw anything you can against it. But then as you start advancing into the higher levels of debate, you start noticing the strategy about what is more effective, and offensive arguments, people seem to be more effective. But like, I'm struggling with this now as a coach, because when I hear people like lay out their case, the best arguments, at least the ones that I'm seeing or think I see, aren't always the offense. Sometimes they're, really good defense about why this won't work or that won't work, rather than why there's a disadvantage, just why it doesn't solve. And so
I think one that we've talked about several times, almost, a common theme through some of these last few weeks was
hello, Tim.
Tim,
hey, how's it going?
Everybody. How are you doing? Was just about how, like, a funding argument. Tim, we're talking about offensive and defensive arguments, and I was just trying to say how, like, one argument that comes to mind that is a defensive argument that we've kind of even talked about was like a funding argument, where you're kind of just being like, yo, like, that costs like too much, and like you're not going to solve as much as you say you are, right? You're not saying...
Hold on a second. A defensive funding argument would be, that's not enough money.
Sure.
That won't pay for it. You know what I mean? That would be one thing. It's like, nope, sorry. Like, if we're going to argue about like the high-speed rail train in California,
that's a good example.
You're right. That some people would say, it's like, okay, what are you going to use to fund this? They're like, oh, $2 billion. You're like, oh, well, that's not enough. So here's my funding argument for that. And that's, if you have a specific piece of evidence that spells out how much a high-speed train costs in California for something like that, then that is, at the very least, it's relevant. But I'm thinking that these arguments are getting overlooked a lot in debate, because I'm just going to say it. I think there's an overemphasis on offense in debate.
It could be.
Yeah, I mean, what do you? So Tim, you just jumped in. What when you were learning the difference between offense and defense in debate, was that, for me, it was like a revelation. You know what I mean? I'm kind of like, oh, yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. Like, do you remember kind of really starting to learn it or master it, or any moment where the offense and defense distinction was really profound?
Yeah, I think I lost a round because, so the common, at least, coaching tip that I hear now is, if you are the member, in either case, start with off case and then move on case. Start with your offensive arguments. And the reason we lost the round was because we were the government team. We were just defending case, and we moved on to, they had like 3 disads or something, and we only got through one of them. So one of the issues is just time allocation, right? But what the judge recommended, and then what every coach after that followed up with, was like, no, always go for offense. Like, that's what you got to do. And, picking up any opportunity that they have, right? So the push was offense is the best defense. And I think you really hit it on the head, right? That if you make a good, solid justification for why something's not possible, that should win the round. Now, all that said, though, I think there's been an overemphasis, like the specific thing that has created this overemphasis on offense, at least in my opinion, is the argument of like risk of solvency, right? Like, risk of solvency seems to win so many damn rounds now. Like, well, if they don't have a good competitive counterplan, so if there's no counterplan present, it's almost like the Gov team goes all in on like, well, we have a plan and they've got nothing, so you got to vote for the team that does something, which isn't really a great argument, but it's still made frequently because it's like, hey, we moved the needle 1%, which is better than 0. I'm not super swayed by that, but I feel like that has become a more common trend. But something that Matt just pointed out, I think that's really relevant is, and we've been talking about it a few times, is spec arguments. Those seem to be so frequently dropped, like not necessarily the procedural, but just on the specifics of plan implementation. So timeline is definitely one of them, but I just saw around like a practice round yesterday that it came down to the time frame. Like, it's impossible to do this in this time frame. It has to be done in this alternative time frame. Otherwise, it will all go to hell. And so that could have been turned into like a counterplan, but they didn't. It was just a justification on like, you say normal means on everything, and that's as far as it usually gets. But there can be, good arguments to be had in, time frame or in funding, as Matt points out.
You know,
Yeah. So real quick, I think that one of the drawbacks to it, what I'm noticing, and when I say that it's overemphasized, I don't think people spend enough time refuting their opponent's arguments.
I see.
All right.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, Matt?
I was gonna say that like coverage, like that's
Yeah.
exactly what I wanted to say. You know, we do so much work, you know, in debate. Like what you really want to do is you want to cover all of your bases. So in a perfect world, right? If you could literally just have a brilliant offensive argument for every single thing somebody says, then great, like good for you. Realistically, in the 10 to 15 seconds, you know, or whatever, however much time you have, I don't know if it's like a quick debate or whatever, but if you have a quick argument you can make and you realize it's defensive and you have nothing else, like I would say it. I mean, like,
Yeah.
like that's like I would not let it stop you just because your coach told you if it's defensive in nature, then you shouldn't say it. Like, and Tim is right. Like the risk of solvency, meaning like if you're scared to not offer some, you know, solution and just say this is a bad idea, or, you know, just discredit, you know, defend as we're talking about. This is kind of like this expectation in debate, and this is kind of goes back to judging philosophy and all that, where it's like, hey, maybe some judge, you know, they want you to hit every single line, and maybe, you know, if you're a speed person and you're going very fast, then yeah, maybe you have no excuse. Why didn't you run a counter plan? You could have spit out, you know, 20 different things. If you are the type who you just really want to like maybe cover all your bases, I still, you just said like, you know, Jared, you know, I really believe coverage on a flow is paramount to almost anything. And once you get cover as much, if not everything, it's really on the debater to be like weighing magnitudes of arguments, and
Sure.
those types of arguments can be used for a defensive argument, and like the realistic nature of what your implications of your argument, even though it's defensive, you know, that's really the that's how you can win on a defensive argument, just like an offensive argument. It's all about the creating the importance with the foundation that you've covered all your bases.
So one example I like to use is the climate change debate, where for some reason in America it seems to be a debate about whether or not it exists, whereas elsewhere in the world most of it is like whether or not your proposal is worth anything. You know, will it solve anything? Will it change the needle as far as temperature increase goes? I think that it's just the stronger argument in a debate. Like, Tim, you were talking about risk of solvency.
Mm-hmm.
My argument, the defensive argument, is there is zero chance that your plan will work. That's not a slight chance. That's a zero. You don't vote for zero chances of something working. Why would we ever do that? Why are we rewarding that? Like we don't reward that outside of debate. How come we're saying that that's good argumentation inside of debate? It's like, well, let's just try anything. Like nobody thinks that way. It's kind of like you're expected to have a solid plan that if it's going to be costing in the millions of billions of dollars, you know what I mean? Something that's well thought out. That's kind of what's expected in real life.
So when you have something that is potential likelihood, I think that's where oftentimes the risk of solvency comes in, is people are like, well, you can't prove. And I think those are really probably the bummer arguments. That's probably what coaches mean when they're dissuading students away from defense, is don't say, well, you can't prove it, because that doesn't really sway anyone, right? Like, that's a common thing that you'll see a lot of, you know, come up in a lot of novice rounds, and that is defensive, but it's not very strong defense. It's like, well, it's not 100%, it's maybe 80%. And that's not super persuasive. But so maybe this is just, I'm interested in your input. If you were to say there's only a 10% chance that this plan, you know, will actually solve any of the harms that they pose, let alone all of them, only 10% chance. Do you still let the government win on risk of solvency if you don't have a competing counter plan? Like, is there, as a judge, there's some bright line of like, this percent is, you know, hey, we'll vote on it, but this one is not?
I feel like
if there is any percentage that it will work versus no chance that something bad will happen, I see the logic in that. I think what the problem is that there's not enough of those teams that are saying like, this will clearly not work. This will clearly not solve this giant problem. I guess the problem is that people have been trained to maximize their harms as much as possible, right? Talk about the worst possible situations,
Nuclear war,
and then provide
Right.
a really small, specific, minor repair to this, and then say this will make it somewhat better. And you're like, dude, you just talked about like genocide, and you want to stop using plastic straws, and well, no, that like we should acknowledge that these two things don't go together. Even if banning plastic straws doesn't produce any disadvantages, like we're going to reward this display of logic right here? No, don't do that. Like I guess not enough people kind of like bring it back down to the level of the game. Like, let's take a look at the game that we're playing. We're trying to show that we know how to persuade an audience. If you think that these giant harms with minor plans is persuasive, I disagree.
Debate spaces are not reality.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I think, what we talk about in here is like, how come when you look at a judge and you say, according to all the information I have, according to the New York Times and according to the Washington Post and according to Wall Street Journal, this is not possible. Or like, what Tim said, or what we're talking about here. Like,
Yeah.
Despite all of that, if you can be like, well, Congress is still running the bill, or like whatever, like there, in debate, we don't really. It's up to the debaters to create the burdens of reality, and it's also up to the team to get rid of all the walls and just show how if there's 1% chance, then I should win. And like, as you get more familiar with the arguments and really like that you're running, I should say, it's just what you're talking about, Jared, is really matching up, your harm to your the plan, or like matching up the amount of money you're investing, let's just say, to like your harms, or at least connecting these dots. Because like it was a funny example when you say like you ban plastic straws in LA and it prevents a genocide in some country somewhere, and it's like, okay, like
Your link story is not
laugh off the butterfly effect, right? Like people in regular conversation kind of laugh that off.
Sure.
Oh yeah, that's kind of funny or something like that. But they don't actually make decisions believing that they can predict the outcome of it. Like that is literally a fallacy of the slippery slope.
Yeah, and like that calling out a fallacy would be like an offensive argument, in my opinion. Like that would
No,
be
that's a defensive.
by itself.
I disagree. I think fallacies are inherently defensive arguments. You're not saying that their conclusion is wrong. You're just saying that their logic sucks. You know what I mean? It's like maybe you're right, but not because of the reasons you said so.
Okay.
So you can come to conclusions. Like I love the movie Idiocracy. There's this one part where he's trying, like there's one smart guy, one average intelligence guy in a world full of idiots, and he has to convince them to put water on their plants. And he's reasoning with them, explaining. It's like, hey,
wait, you mean water in the toilet?
What?
No,
yeah,
water.
water in the toilet. And it's like he's trying to reason with them about how it'll grow and be nutritious and everything like that. And eventually, the reason he convinces them is that he says that he can talk to plants, and they believe him, and they said that the plants want the water, and that's how he convinces them. So. His conclusion, he got there through a really stupid way, but that's how I'm saying. It's kind of like your conclusion might be fine, your plan might be fine, but not for the reasons you said so. And we should be taking into account all of your speech, not just plan text. It seems like people are kind of like, here's my plan text, try to prove me wrong. I'm not going to defend anything I said. It's like, oh, maybe it won't work, but there's a chance. It's like, no, like go harder on the defense, push harder, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I think to the point of stock issues that we've now covered a few of them, like solvency is a frequently glossed over, just assumptive stock issue. Like
Right.
that is one of the cornerstones in a debate that, the government or the affirmative team across any platform of debate, they have a burden to prove how it solves, giving those mechanisms. Like those link stories frequently are just like blipped out, like the plan passes and therefore, and then like it runs into the wild. So that's where I think there may have been this like de-emphasis on, from a technical standpoint, on no linking things, right? Where kind of to the logic you're pointing out, like there is no link between the plan, and these things happening. Like your internal links don't add up. Instead, there's this push on like everything has to be a turn. It has to be instead by like banning plastic straws, that's gonna piss off the Republicans, which empowers Israel, which means a preemptive strike, which means nuclear war. And like, does it really?
You know what's funny?
You know, that link story is just as bad as the other one. You would have been better off no linking than trying to turn it into something insane.
Right.
Just how like exactly, like the judges will all tell you so often, like, just I'm not going to connect the dots for you. Like they'll say that to you. You know what I mean? And so it's really smart in my mind. What I meant earlier, Jared, by saying it's offensive is to you basically call out a critique. Basically, we were saying this is a fallacy. They are basing this linkage on a fallacy. It's called like a slippery slope that's not based on any logical premise aside from it is a possibility of things that can happen, and I threw a number on there, or and like by calling that out expressly in a round, and then like having a language critique, kind of like Tim said last week, where it's like that is an offensive. That in my mind, you can almost turn it to be like, if you vote for this plan, you're voting for you're voting on a plan based on which impacts are based on a fallacy. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting how, like you said, it's like you see it as a defensive argument, and you kind of changed my mind when you said how you explained it, but I kind of meant it in that way, where you expressly like almost make this new argument now, where you're like, boom, excuse me for a second. What their whole solvency, what we're talking about right now, is not connected to their impacts in any way that we can tangibly see. You know what I mean? Or like it hasn't been fleshed out to the degree where you should be able to vote on their impacts.
Yeah, if somebody built a strategy of just pointing out fallacies, I don't think they'd win that much. Because I think offense is so overpowered. I think like people are like most of the judging pool is already sort of calibrated towards it. It's kind of like I need some offense in order to vote for you. You know what I mean? Like even though we talked about trying to be a good judge and things like that. Like maybe this is part of that. Like how do you treat offense and defense ought to be part of, it's like, well, how much weight do you give each one of them? Or at the very least, just, be conscious of it and tell people. That could be part of a philosophy. I think I have to change my judging philosophy now.
There are times too. I mean, this is a preference, and I think that like I'm never going to tell some debater not to be who they are or how their coach told them to be if that's what they want. But like, there's an aspect of like genuineness too, because I know like Jared, for instance, this guy, he's a real debater right here. Like he will have like a hardcore response to pretty much anything I'm gonna say to him. But like, there are times in a round where like when you just are machine gunning like you said, Tim, like if you just take any little thing I do and turn it into a genocide somewhere or a nuclear war, right? It just is so not genuine. It sounds like you're kind of just saying what your coach told you more than you're really explaining the linkage of how it all goes down. No one's going to vote on a debater who doesn't understand what they're saying. I mean, truly, like once cross happens or once things start interacting with each other and you realize that the student is merely just like regurgitating information. Like they don't know what they're saying. You know what I mean? Like, understand how these things work. It's very hard. I mean, if you don't understand, it can be hard, but like it's so crucial to like even the way you can interact offensively or defensively with arguments that you're able to creatively change the way you use them against certain against other teams.
The interaction between debaters, I think if everyone's always going for offense and nobody's ever going for defense, then there's certain skills that are kind of atrophying now. You know what I mean? There's not as much clash that's happening. Sure. And I do appreciate it's like, I don't have a response to that. I don't have a good response to that. And you're trying to pick and choose where you're going for. But that's what I love the most is seeing people go back and forth and trying to figure it out throughout the debate. But oftentimes, it's like the funny thing is this try or die argument, for solvency is itself defense, right? It's kind of like you're not trying to prove that it's like, oh no, our plan works even better now that you mention it. They're just saying, it's like, well, you're right. It might be crappy, but it's not, disadvantageous. And so that's defense. That wins rounds, right? That's
kind of funny. Yeah,
that's the thing that wins rounds. You know what I mean? But the thing is that people don't go. They don't initiate that enough. I think it's a pretty crappy argument. It's kind of like, yep, you got us.
I've even heard
I've
even heard in rounds, like as a judge, I can remember, it's been a while since I've competed, but people will literally be like, oh, that was a defensive argument, you shouldn't even like vote on it. Like they'll even say stuff like that, like a round, and it's kind of like, that may be true. I mean, okay, that's smart. Maybe it's important that they see it. It's kind of good that they mention it, but like, let's just say that like if you give an argument, someone refutes it with a defensive argument, simply coming up and trying to rejoin by merely saying, don't vote for that, it was defensive, I don't think by itself is that's not a rejoinder. That is like this kind of like you can say that as long as you also give like some, we do solve, there's a risk of solvency, there's some ground on top of the fact that like you can classify arguments, like that's good, but like we didn't come here for you to teach me, that was a disadvantage and it was, like whatever, like I don't need you to tell me what it was. It's okay if you tell me, if you provide more offense or like something, but like don't just like say don't vote for that because it was defensive. That's not enough for me.
The irony is like that argument is in and of itself defensive.
Sure,
that's hilarious. People don't see it, right? And so like I don't know. I see it more now because I've just been in it a long time, I think.
So one of the really good arguments, and part of what prompted the idea that I had for like let's discuss offense versus defense, was a round that I recently saw where it was an LD round, actually, like a super technical discussion of geothermal power. And the guy that was on the neg team had done a stupid amount of research into this one particular, it was really fortunate, but it was in this one particular kind of geothermal energy. And his entire off case, he was like, I have no off case positions. And I was like, whoa, really? Because, he was very, competitive, very successful debaters. Like, I got no off case positions. I have in my 8 minutes, one turn, and I've got, a couple case responses. Super smooth, calm, clear, laid out with his turn, because he pointed out like, no, looks like if you look at the, the geochemistry of this particular thing, it turns out the carbon fought, whatever, and went into this super specific detail. It was really impressive. And then he's like, and then here's also a bunch of reasons why this won't happen. And it wasn't even saying like, we're going to get the solvency down to 0. It was, there's no way for the government team to know this. I have done the research on the study that he's citing. And it's this classification that's saying there is this small potential. And what they're arguing is an argument to ignorance, an argument ad ignoratum. Like they are basing their solvency on a fallacy. They're saying because we don't know what it will solve or like what, the possibilities could be, they're like, don't you agree? So it was a really good, well set up in cross-sex. Like, don't you think that in technology arguments, people get really carried away and really excited with what can happen? And the guy's like, well, yeah, I suppose. It's like, okay, great. This is the basis. Like your solvency is based on a logical fallacy. We can't vote on it because that isn't like pointed out the fallacy. And I thought that was really clever defense. And then gutsy as hell that he had literally no off case besides that one turn of like, this thing actually increases greenhouse gas emissions. And it wasn't a big thing. And like the AF had very little, if anything, to argue against because like just the research wasn't there. He like literally went to a bona fide physicist to explain to him why this, mechanism happened. So when you have like really concrete evidence, that stuff's awesome. But I think it proved the point that you don't have to have a million off case positions in order to like have one thing that sticks. It was basically some solid ground defense and pointing out the fallacy. That in itself can be enough. So I think that's a useful area to, look at as a judge.
I heard this one analogy, and then we'll wrap it up. This old story about a mother-daughter cooking, and she has a certain cut of meat, and the first thing she does is cut off a little chunk of meat and throw it into the fire. And daughter's like, why do you do that? She's like, I don't know. My mom always did this. And then she asked her mom, why did you do that? She's like, I don't know. My mom always did this. And she asked her mom, it was grandma, and said, why did you always cut off that one piece of meat? He's like, oh, well, my pan was too small, so I always had to cut it off to make it fit. And so while the point is like, at one point, this was probably a really good argument in some debates, and then it worked, and then people use it all the time, the try or die thing, right? And now it's all the time, and people are kind of like, oh, well, they try to use it in every single scenario, and then I think there's more times than people take advantage of where they're just making an argument from ignorance or a slippery slope argument, and then they're trying to defend it. They're trying to defend a bad argument with a try or die response.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I was droning on, everybody. That's been 30 minutes. Join us next week for another episode. I think we're going to be doing it a little bit later next week, so still join on in. I'm here with Matthew Shapiro, JD, Tim Seavey from Visolutions. I'm Jared Kubika Miller. We are all from DebateSeinsei. See you next week.
Thank you.